She had been talking to a dying man for 3 weeks before she found out he owned half the city. And the worst part? He had heard every single word. There is a particular kind of loneliness that money cannot fix. Most people never discover this, because most people never have enough money to test the theory. But Damien Holt had tested it thoroughly. He had tested it in a penthouse overlooking the Hudson River. He had tested it at a dinner table set for 12 where 11 chairs stayed empty because the only guests who ever showed up wanted something from him. He had tested it in boardrooms where 40 people applauded every word he said, and not one of them would have crossed the street to save his life if the applause stopped. And now he was testing it in a private hospital suite at Meridian Medical Center in Manhattan, lying completely still, connected to machines that breathed for him, while the most powerful technology empire in America slowly began to eat itself alive outside these walls. Damien Holt had not spoken in 19 days. He had not moved in 19 days. His eyes had not opened in 19 days. And yet if you stood very still in room 412 of the private ward and listened carefully between the beeping of the monitors, you could hear something that had no medical explanation whatsoever. You could hear him fighting. Not the kind of fighting a doctor could measure. Not brain scans or blood pressure readings. The kind that happens in the part of a person that exists before language, before memory, before the self even has a name. The kind of fighting that only begins when someone lost in the darkness finds something worth fighting toward. That something arrived every evening at exactly 7:15, pushing a cleaning cart down the corridor of the private ward with one squeaky wheel that announced her the way a town crier might have announced a queen. Except that nobody looked up when Nora Adeyemi walked past. That was the thing about people who cleaned hospitals. They were invisible in the way furniture was invisible. Present everywhere. Noticed nowhere. Essential to everything. Acknowledged by absolutely no one. Nora was 31 years old and had the kind of face that looked younger when she was laughing and decades older when she thought no one was watching. She was Nigerian American, raised in the Bronx by a mother who had worked 2 jobs her entire life and still managed to teach her daughter 3 things before she died. That every person deserved to be spoken to with dignity. That silence was something you gave a room, not a person. And a Yoruba prayer so old no one alive could trace its origin, a prayer her mother had whispered over her every night and that Nora now whispered over her son Kofi every night. Because some things were worth carrying forward even when you were barely strong enough to carry yourself. Kofi was 3 years old. He had his father's nose and his grandmother's laugh and his mother's stubborn refusal to accept that the world was only the way it appeared to be. He also had a habit of pointing at every single bird he saw and announcing it with the word he had invented for all birds regardless of species. The word sounded exactly like Bobo, and he said it with the gravity of a scientist naming a new element. Every pigeon was Bobo. Every sparrow. Every hawk circling the overpass near their apartment in the South Bronx. Kofi would point and say Bobo and look at his mother waiting for confirmation, and Nora always confirmed it, because watching her son discover the world was the only part of her day when everything else stopped mattering completely. She first spoke to the man in room 412 on her 4th shift. Not because she knew anything about him beyond the name on the chart at the foot of the bed. Holt D. Not because she had any particular reason to. She had cleaned his room for 3 nights in complete silence the way she cleaned every room, efficiently and invisibly. And on the 4th night, she came in and found the room exactly as she always found it. Machines beeping their steady rhythm. Fresh flowers on the windowsill tilting toward the glass the way flowers did when they were leaning toward the only warmth available. The man in the bed utterly still. Utterly alone. Except that night something was different. Something she noticed only because Nora paid attention to things other people had trained themselves not to see. There had been no visitors that entire day. She knew because the sign-in sheet outside the private ward showed only medical staff. And the man in the bed looked, in a way she could not have explained to anyone, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with 19 days of unconsciousness. He looked like someone who had been alone his entire life and had simply, finally, stopped pretending it was fine. Nora set her mop against the wall, pulled the plastic chair close to the bed, sat down, and said in the same quiet voice she used when she put Kofi to sleep that she was going to tell him about her day whether he liked it or not, because she had learned from her mother that silence was something you gave a room, not a person. And this man had been given enough silence to last several lifetimes. She talked for 11 minutes that first night. About Kofi and the birds. About the subway delay that made her 7 minutes late and the supervisor who noticed, but said nothing, which was somehow worse than being told off. About the jollof rice she had left on the stove and her neighbor Mrs. Ferreira, who always knocked to check on it when Nora worked late. A kindness so small and so consistent it had quietly become one of the load-bearing walls of Nora's entire life, without either of them ever once naming it that way. She did not know that the man in the bed heard every word. If you are enjoying this story so far, hit that like button right now and make sure you are subscribed, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about this man. If you want to understand what it feels like to be trapped inside a coma, imagine standing at the bottom of a very deep body of water where the surface is lit but impossibly far above, and every attempt to move toward it costs more than you have. Damien had been at the bottom for 19 days. He had heard the doctors speak in the careful, bloodless language of people delivering bad news to someone who was not technically present to receive it. He had heard his business partner Raymond Cole speaking in the corridor in that particular tone people use when they are performing grief for an audience they respect more than the person they are supposedly grieving. He had heard his personal assistant of 7 years crying quietly in the corner of the room on the second day and then never coming back, because someone had told her the visits were disruptive. He had heard all of it from the bottom of the water, and none of it had been enough to make the surface seem worth reaching. Then a woman sat down beside him and told him about a 3-year-old boy who called every bird in the world Bobo. It was not the story itself. It was the way she told it. Without performance. Without the careful, measured tone people used when they knew they were being watched or remembered. She told it the way people only told things when they genuinely expected nothing back. And Damien, at the bottom of his water, felt something shift. A current. Small enough that no machine in that room registered it, but real enough that for the first time in 19 days he stopped drifting deeper and simply stayed still, which in the language of comas is the first word in the sentence that eventually becomes waking up. Now let us go back to the beginning, because a story like this one does not start in a hospital room. It starts much earlier, in the kind of place where the ending feels completely impossible until it isn't. Damien Holt grew up in Akron, Ohio, in a house where the heat was turned off every February because the money ran out, and his mother would stack every blanket they owned on top of him and his younger sister Priya and say it was a camping adventure, with a smile so convincing that Damien believed her until he was 11 and realized that the camping adventure happened every single year on the exact same week that the heating bill was due. His father left when Damien was 9, not dramatically, not in a fight or a flood of explanations. He just stopped coming home one Tuesday, and by Thursday it was clear he was not coming back. He left behind a socket wrench, a library book on car engines that was 3 weeks overdue, and a son who decided that same Thursday that he would never in his life need anything from anyone, because needing things from people was how you ended up alone in a cold house pretending February was an adventure. By 22, Damien had built his first software company out of a studio apartment using a laptop he bought on a payment plan and the particular kind of focus that only belongs to people who are genuinely terrified of going backwards. By 26, he sold it for enough money to retire and immediately started a second company because retirement felt like surrender, and Damien Holt did not surrender to anything. By 34, he had built Holt Systems into one of the 10 largest technology companies in the country, with 17,000 employees, offices on 4 continents, and a personal net worth that finance magazines printed in numbers so large they stopped feeling like real money and started feeling like a score in a video game. He had also, somewhere along the way, become almost completely alone. Not because he was difficult, though people who had worked for him would have described him using words that politely circled that conclusion. Not because he was cruel, though he had made decisions that affected thousands of people with the same emotional register. He used to choose what to have for breakfast. But because somewhere around the time the first company sold and the money arrived, the people around him changed. They did not change dramatically. They changed the way the temperature changes in early autumn, gradually and then all at once, until one day Damien looked around a room full of people celebrating his success and realized that not one of them would have been there if the success had gone the other way. He had a therapist once who told him that his inability to trust people was a defense mechanism rooted in his father's abandonment. And Damien had fired her the following week not because she was wrong, but because being accurately diagnosed by someone you were paying felt deeply unsatisfying. He had a girlfriend once, for almost 2 years, a woman named Serena who was warm and funny and patient in a way that baffled him, and he had ended it on a Tuesday evening with the efficiency of someone closing a business deal. Because she had told him she loved him, and the only thing he had felt in response was the low cold panic of a man who does not believe he deserves something good. Serena had looked at him for a long moment after he explained that this was not working and said something he had never forgotten. She said that she felt sorry for whoever was standing next to him when he finally figured out what he was running from. Then she left and he never called her, and he had thought about that sentence every single day since. He was thinking about it, somewhere in the deep gray bottom of his coma. On the 4th night when Nora Adeyemi pulled up a plastic chair and told him about jollof rice and subway delays, and a little boy who had named every bird in the world after a single beautiful sound. Now on the surface, while Damien lay in room 412 holding on to the voice of a woman he could not see, the world he had built was in the process of destroying itself with impressive efficiency. The stroke had come without warning. That was the detail that unsettled everyone who heard about it because Damien Holt was 41 years old, exercised with the discipline of someone trying to outrun something, and had the kind of clean medical history that made doctors use the word exceptional before they delivered the news that exceptional meant absolutely nothing when a blood vessel in the brain decided it had simply had enough. He collapsed in the middle of a product launch presentation. 40 people in the room. 17 cameras live streaming to an audience of 60,000. He was mid-sentence when it happened, and the video clip, which someone inevitably posted before anyone had the sense to ask them not to, showed the exact moment his legs stopped holding him with a clarity that made it painful to watch. The clip had 42 million views by the time he arrived at the hospital. Raymond Cole, Damien's business partner of 11 years and the co-founder of Holt Systems, held a press conference the following morning in a charcoal suit that somehow already fit the occasion perfectly, which Damien's head of security Solomon Briggs noted with the flat professional suspicion that was his default setting for almost everything. Raymond spoke about Damien with the warmth of a eulogy and the precision of a corporate filing, expressing confidence in the company's leadership structure while expressing deep personal concern for his friend and partner, and managing to do both things in a single sentence in a way that left everyone feeling reassured and no one feeling comforted. 16 hours later, Raymond sent a private message to 4 board members suggesting that given the uncertainty surrounding Damien's prognosis, a contingency leadership framework might be worth discussing. The message was careful and reasonable and completely devastating in the way that truly dangerous things often were. Solomon Briggs intercepted the message the same way Solomon intercepted most things, which was to say quietly and without anyone noticing and without telling anyone what he had found until he decided what to do with it. Solomon had been Damien's head of security for 6 years and operated on the principle that information was only useful when you knew exactly the right moment to use it. He stood outside room 412 every day in a dark suit and said very little and noticed everything. He noticed which visitors came with genuine distress on their faces and which came with the careful blankness of people conducting an assessment. He noticed which calls Raymond took in the corridor and which ones he walked to the stairwell for. And he noticed, on the 5th evening, that the cleaning woman who came into room 412 every night stayed 11 minutes longer than any other room on the floor and came back out looking slightly less tired than she went in. Solomon filed this information away and said nothing because Solomon Briggs had not kept Damien Holt alive this long by saying things before he understood them completely. Nora did not think about what she was doing as anything other than what it was. She was talking to a man who had no one talking to him because it seemed like the most basic human thing to offer. She was not naive about who he might be. The private ward, the armed security presence, the daily fresh flowers, the parade of visitors in expensive suits with calculating eyes, none of this suggested an ordinary man. But she had also seen enough of life to know that expensive suits and calculating visitors were not the same as being loved, and whatever this man was in the world outside this room, inside this room he was simply someone drowning in silence. And Nora had been raised to believe that was something worth interrupting. On the 7th night, she told him about Kofi's father. Not because she had planned to. Not because she had told anyone else. But because she had been alone with the weight of it for so long that when she sat down beside someone who could not judge her or repeat what she said or look at her with that particular expression people put on when they were deciding how to respond to something inconvenient, the words came out like something that had been waiting for exactly this kind of door. Daniel had been kind in the beginning, she said. The kind that you didn't question because it felt like water after a long thirst. But kindness in the beginning was not a promise. She had learned that. She had learned it the same way most women learned it, slowly at first, and then all at once, in a series of small moments that each seemed explainable on their own and only made sense as a pattern when you were already deep inside the pattern with no obvious way out. Daniel had not been violent. She said this in the way you say something when you want to be accurate and also want to be believed, and both things are complicated by the fact that the world has decided there is a threshold of harm below which things do not count and above which they do. And everything below the threshold gets swept into a category called difficult, which means that you were allowed to leave, but not allowed to be believed about why it took you so long. Daniel had simply been the kind of man who needed her smaller than she was. Who needed her quieter. Who needed her less certain, less direct, less capable of filling a room with the force of her own presence. And Nora had spent 2.5 years making herself smaller and quieter and less certain before she woke up one morning, looked at her son asleep in his crib, and understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that she was teaching Kofi what a woman was supposed to look like, and she did not want this to be the lesson. She left that Tuesday, with Kofi on her hip and 2 bags and the prayer her mother had taught her moving through her lips the whole way to Mrs. Ferreira's door, where she stood and knocked at 6 in the morning and said she needed 2 days, and Mrs. Ferreira stepped aside without a single question because some people understood what was happening in a moment and did not require an explanation, and Nora had been surviving on the grace of those people her entire life. She finished talking and sat in the quiet of room 412 for a moment, and then laughed at herself, a small short laugh, and said she did not know why she was telling a sleeping man things she had not told her closest friend, and apologized in case he was somehow listening and found it all very boring, and said goodnight and left. And at the bottom of the water, Damien Holt felt the current again. Stronger this time. A pull toward the surface he had not felt in 23 days. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, you are not alone. Share it with one person right now who needs to hear that kindness is never wasted. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it now, because what is coming in the next part of this story is something you genuinely will not see coming. On the surface, things were accelerating. Raymond Cole had moved from private messages to private meetings. Solomon knew about 3 of them. He suspected there were more. The meetings involved 2 board members, one of whom had a financial relationship with a competitor that had never quite been disclosed to the full board, and a lawyer whose specialty was corporate restructuring in situations involving incapacitated leadership. The meetings were short. The participants arrived separately and left separately. The kind of choreography that people only performed when they knew what they were doing was not quite right, but had decided to do it anyway. Solomon also knew that Damien had no family. No spouse, no children. One sister in Portland who he had not spoken to in 4 years over a disagreement about their mother's estate that had calcified into estrangement the way those things did. When both people were too proud to make the first move and too hurt to believe the first move would be received well. He had called Priya on the 2nd day. She had answered on the 5th ring with the voice of someone who had been waiting for a call they had been afraid to receive, and said she would be on the first flight, and then been visibly unsure what to do with herself for the 4 days she spent at the hospital, sitting beside her brother's bed and talking to him in halting sentences that kept stopping at the edges of the things that actually needed saying. She flew back to Portland on the 8th day with the look of someone who had not resolved anything and knew it. So when Raymond Cole's restructuring lawyer filed the first legal motion on day 22, there was no family member to contest it. There was only Solomon Briggs, who was not family and had no legal standing, standing outside room 412 in his dark suit reading the filing on his phone with the expression of a man who had been expecting something and was nonetheless disturbed to see it arrive. That evening Nora came in at 7:15 with her squeaky wheel and her cart, and she sat down beside Damien and told him about Kofi's new word, which was not Bobo, which was still in active use for birds, but a new word for rain, which Kofi had decided should be called Sha-Sha, announced with great solemnity every time it touched the window. She said her son was going to grow up to be either a poet or a meteorologist, and she was prepared to be proud either way. She said the jollof rice had been better last night than it had been in weeks, and she was choosing to interpret this as a sign that things were turning around, because she was a person who believed in signs when the signs were convenient and dismissed them when they were not, which she acknowledged was not a philosophically consistent position, but was an extremely practical one. She said Kofi had asked about his father again last night. Just once, in the middle of dinner, with the directness of a 3-year-old who did not yet understand that some questions were complicated. He had said, "Mama, where is Daddy?" and she had said, "Daddy lives somewhere else now," and Kofi had said, "Oh," and gone back to his rice, satisfied in the way that children were satisfied by answers that confirmed the shape of what they already suspected. And Nora had held it together until he was asleep and then sat on the kitchen floor and cried for 20 minutes, because 20 minutes was all she could afford before she had to get up and pack Kofi's bag for Mrs. Ferreira and get to her shift. She told Damien this, and then she said something she had not planned to say. She said she hoped, wherever he was inside all that silence, that he was not alone the way she sometimes felt alone. That there was something in there keeping him company. That he was not just waiting but moving toward something. Because she had learned in her life that surviving was not the same as fighting forward, and fighting forward required a direction, and direction required something that felt like it was worth arriving at. She stood up to leave and paused at the door and said what she always said at the end. She said, "Good night, Damien." And then she said, the way she said goodnight to Kofi, that she would be back tomorrow. She did not see the monitor behind her. She did not see the number on the heart rate display climb 11 points in the 30 seconds it took her to walk out of the room. The doctor on duty saw it. She stood in the corridor staring at the readout with the expression of someone reconciling what the data said with what the data was supposed to be able to say. She checked the timestamp. She checked the medication log. She checked every variable that was supposed to explain an 11-point cardiac response in a patient with no voluntary neurological function. She found nothing. She wrote in the chart that the fluctuation was unexplained and flagged it for the attending physician in the morning and went back to her rounds. Because hospitals were full of unexplained things and you had to keep moving or the unexplained things would stop you completely. What she did not write in the chart was what she had seen in the 11 seconds she stood in the doorway before the cleaning woman left the room. She did not write that the woman had said goodnight to the patient by his first name, or that she had said it with the particular tenderness of someone who meant it. She did not write this because it was not a clinical observation. But she thought about it for the rest of her shift and could not entirely explain why. Nora's crisis arrived on a Thursday, which was the kind of day crises preferred, late in the week when your defenses were already worn down from the accumulated weight of Monday through Wednesday. She had been called into the office of the hospital's facilities manager, a man named Gerald Park who wore short-sleeved dress shirts year-round in a way that suggested someone had once told him it was casual and approachable, and he had simply never updated the information. Gerald told Nora, with the practiced sympathy of someone delivering bad news they were not personally responsible for, that the hospital had contracted with a new cleaning services company starting the following month. That all current contracted cleaning staff would not be automatically transferred, that she could apply to the new company directly, but that there were no guarantees, and that he was very sorry and he meant that sincerely. Nora sat across from Gerald Park and nodded and thanked him and walked out into the corridor and stood against the wall for 30 seconds with her eyes closed and her hands pressed flat against the painted cinder block behind her, grounding herself in the physical reality of the surface, because if she let herself float for even a moment, she would drift somewhere she could not afford to go right now. She had $740 in her checking account. She had 11 days until rent. She had Kofi's daycare payment due in 6 days, which was not optional, because without daycare there was no shift, and without the shift there was nothing. She had a bill from the pediatrician from 2 months ago that she had been deferring with the particular skill of someone who had been deferring bills long enough to know exactly how long she could defer each specific one before it became a collections issue. And she had, effective next month, no guaranteed income. She stood against that wall for 30 seconds. Then she opened her eyes, straightened up, and went back to work, because Nora Adeyemi had learned that the wall was there for 30 seconds, and then you had to move, because nobody was coming to move you. That night she came into room 412 and sat down and told Damien about Gerald Park and the short-sleeve shirts and the contract termination. She told it with a dark humor that she had developed the way you developed any survival skill, out of pure necessity over years of practice. She said Gerald had delivered the news with the face of a man genuinely grieved by a decision. He was also definitely not going to do anything to reverse, which was a very specific and impressive kind of uselessness. She said she had $740 and 11 days, and a son who called birds Bobo and rain Shasha, and that she was going to figure it out because she had always figured it out. But that tonight she was going to be allowed to sit here for 11 minutes and tell a sleeping man about it first, because sometimes you needed to say a thing out loud before you could start solving it. She was not crying. Nora Adeyemi very rarely cried when she was afraid. She cried when she was relieved. Fear made her quiet and focused and precise. It was only when the fear was over and the thing you had been afraid of had not happened after all that the tears came, and they came with an intensity that always surprised her, as if her body had been saving them up for the right moment and then released them all at once when the danger passed. She had learned this about herself. She found it inconvenient but could not argue with the pattern. She said goodnight to Damien. She said she would be back tomorrow. She stood up. And Damien Holt opened his eyes. Not slowly, the way people woke from comas in movies, with a gentle flutter and a gradual orientation to the world. He opened them the way someone opened a door they had been pressing against from the other side, suddenly and with intention, and the gray eyes that looked up at the ceiling of room 412 were not confused or vacant. They were exhausted and raw and completely alert, and they moved immediately to the figure standing beside his bed, and they stayed there. Nora looked at those open eyes and felt every single thing in her body stop at once. Her breath. Her thoughts. The ambient noise of the hospital. Everything. For 3 seconds the room had no sound except the monitors and her own heartbeat. Then she pressed the call button and said, very quietly, to no one and to him, "I knew you were listening." What followed was exactly what you would expect to follow, and also nothing like what you would expect at all. Within 4 minutes, room 412 had 6 people in it, none of whom were Nora, who had been gently but firmly moved to the corridor with the efficient kindness medical staff used on people who were present for something significant, but were not family and therefore could not technically be there. She stood in the hallway with her cleaning cart and watched through the narrow window in the door as doctors and nurses moved around the bed with the focused energy of people for whom this moment was a professional event and not a personal one. She watched Damien's hand grip the bed rail with a slowness that looked like an enormous effort and still looked like certainty. She watched his lips form words she could not hear. She watched the doctor lean close to receive them and then straighten up with an expression that moved through disbelief and arrived at something that looked like wonder. Solomon Briggs appeared at the end of the corridor at a pace that suggested he had not been walking normally since his phone rang 30 seconds ago. He looked at Nora standing outside the room and slowed down. He looked at her cleaning cart. He looked at her face. And something moved behind his eyes that was not quite a question and not quite an answer, but was somewhere precisely between the two. He said, "You are the one who comes every night." Nora said yes. Solomon looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once, the way people nodded when something they had suspected had been confirmed, and walked into the room to see his boss. Drop a comment right now and tell us what you felt when he opened his eyes. And if you have not liked this video yet, do it now because the next part is where everything changes and you do not want to miss a single second. The first person Damien spoke to at any length was not a doctor. It was not Solomon. It was not Raymond Cole, who arrived at the hospital within the hour wearing the expression of a man who had received news he needed to visibly celebrate while quietly recalibrating a series of plans. It was not his sister Priya, who got the call in Portland and booked a flight and arrived the following morning with red eyes and the look of someone who had spent 7 hours on a plane rehearsing things to say and still did not know how to start. The first person Damien spoke to was Nora. Not that first night, when he was surrounded by medical staff and his body was reclaiming itself from 19 days of stillness, with all the grace of someone trying to restart a car that had been parked in a field through an entire winter. But the following evening, when the doctors had completed their assessments and declared his recovery something they were going to be writing about in journals for years, and the room had finally quieted to its normal rhythms, Damien asked Solomon, in a voice still rough from 19 days of disuse, where the woman was. Solomon said which woman in a tone that confirmed he knew exactly which woman. Damien said the one who talks. Solomon left the room and came back 12 minutes later with a woman in a light blue cleaning uniform and a ponytail who stood at the door of room 412 with her hands folded in front of her and looked at the man in the bed with the expression of someone who had been quietly expecting something for a long time and was now uncertain what to do with the fact that it had arrived. Damien looked at her. His gray eyes, which the people who worked for him had described in various contexts as unreadable, cold, and in one memorable exit interview as looking directly through the back of your skull, were none of those things in this moment. They were the eyes of a man who had been at the bottom of a dark body of water for 3 weeks and had found his way to the surface by following a voice and was now looking at the person the voice belonged to. He said, "You told me about a boy who calls birds Bobo." Nora stood in the doorway and felt something in her chest move sideways. She said yes. He said he wanted to know if the boy was real or if he had imagined that part. She said he was very real. She said his name was Kofi and he was 3 years old and yesterday he had decided that the sound a bus made was also Bobo, which was going to create a significant classificatory problem down the line. Damien looked at her for a moment. And then, for the first time in a very long time, he laughed. It was short and rough and clearly surprised him as much as it surprised her, the laugh of someone who had forgotten they were capable of the thing until their body simply did it without permission. He brought his hand up to his face and held it there for a moment, and when he moved it away his eyes were different again, not cold and not raw, but something in between that did not have a common name. He said he had heard everything she told him. Nora said she knew. He said he was sorry for what she was going through with the job. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had not told him that so he would feel obligated. She had told him because she needed to say it out loud to someone who could not make it about themselves. She said she hoped he understood the difference. Damien said he understood the difference. He said he was not sure anyone had ever explained that distinction to him quite that directly before. Nora said she found that genuinely hard to believe given how many people surrounded him, and then immediately said she was sorry because that was probably not an appropriate thing to say to someone who had just woken from a coma. Damien said it was the most appropriate thing anyone had said to him in several years and asked her to please sit down. She sat. And they talked for 40 minutes, which was longer than Damien had talked to any single person in a context that was not a meeting in the better part of a decade. She told him about Kofi in the specific and unself-conscious way she had been telling him for 19 nights, about the birds and the rain and the entirely new taxonomy her son was constructing for the world. He told her, haltingly and with the particular stiffness of someone who had not practiced this kind of honesty, about Akron and the February cold and a father who left on a Tuesday and a mother who called it camping. Nora listened with the quality of attention that some people had and most did not, the kind that made the person talking feel not observed but accompanied. When she stood up to leave, he said her name. Not Nora because he did not know it yet. He said, "Excuse me," and she turned around, and he asked what her name was. She told him. He said it once, quietly, the way you said a word that you recognized from somewhere and were placing where you had heard it before. She left. And Damien lay in the silence of room 412, which was still technically silent, but felt, for the first time in 19 days, like a different kind of silence. Not the silence of being alone. The silence of a room where someone had recently been and would come back. Solomon knocked and entered and stood at the foot of the bed and said he had something Damien needed to know. He said it was about Raymond. He said he had been waiting for the right moment and understood that this was both a terrible moment and the only moment available. He placed his phone on the bed with the messages and the meeting records and the lawyers filing on the screen. Damien read all of it without changing expression. This was the thing about people who had grown up cold. They received terrible information the way other people received weather. Without surprise. Without the luxury of visible collapse. He read to the end. Then he set the phone down. Then he was quiet for a moment that Solomon did not interrupt, because Solomon understood silence the way Nora understood it, as something that needed to finish itself. Then Damien said, "How long do I need to be in this bed before I can sit at a table?" Solomon said the doctor had said a week minimum. Damien said to get his lawyer on the phone. Solomon said it was 2 a.m. Damien said he was aware of that and asked Solomon to get his lawyer on the phone. Solomon got the lawyer on the phone. Because some wars did not wait for you to finish recovering from the last one. And Damien Holt had not built everything he had built by waiting for a convenient moment to fight back. He had built it by understanding that the convenient moment was a myth, and that the only real choice was between fighting now and not fighting at all. The difference this time was that he had something he had never had before when the fight started. He had a reason that had nothing to do with proving anything or escaping anything. He had a boy who called birds Bobo and a woman who sat with dying strangers and spoke to them as if their silence was temporary and their value was not. And that turned out to make a very significant difference. Please like and subscribe right now, because what happens with Raymond Cole and what Damien does next is the part of this story that nobody sees coming, and we are going to get into all of it. Stay with us. Raymond Cole's assumption, which was also his fatal error, was that Damien Holt waking from a coma would be a diminished version of the man who had gone in. This was a reasonable assumption in the same way that most catastrophic misreadings of a person were reasonable at the time. Damien had spent 19 days unconscious. His body had lost mass. His voice was still rough. He moved with the deliberate care of someone relearning the dimensions of their own physical presence. He looked, to anyone observing from a slight distance, like a man who would need considerable time to reconstitute himself. What Raymond had not accounted for was that 19 days at the bottom of a dark body of water, with nothing to do but listen and wait and hold on to the thread of a voice, was not the same as 19 days of rest. It was 19 days of clarity. Every distraction gone. Every performance impossible. Every layer of the life Damien had built stripped back to its structural reality. And what that structural reality showed him, with the merciless precision of a blueprint, was exactly what the building was made of, which walls were load-bearing and which were decoration, and which people in his life were which. He called a board meeting for day 26, 5 days after he woke, from his hospital bed, via video link. With Solomon standing off camera and his lawyer present and a document prepared that the lawyer described as comprehensive and that Raymond's lawyer would later describe in a legal filing as breathtaking in scope and execution. It had taken 3 days to prepare it. It had taken 19 days of lying at the bottom of dark water to understand exactly what needed to be in it. Raymond joined the video call from his office in the company headquarters. He was wearing the kind of suit he wore when he needed to look like the most prepared person in the room. He had 2 people flanking him at the table. He opened the meeting with a statement about being relieved and grateful that Damien was recovering. Damien let him finish. Then he said, "Raymond, I need you to open the document that was just sent to your email." Raymond opened it. The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. What the document contained was every message, every meeting record, every communication between Raymond and the 2 board members and the restructuring lawyer. assembled with the precision of someone who had been watching and waiting and who understood that information was only useful when you knew exactly the right moment to use it. It also contained a board vote, already secured before the meeting began, from 7 of the 11 board members, including 3 whom Raymond had believed were aligned with him. Solomon had spent the 5 days since Damien woke making calls. Solomon was very good at making calls. Damien said he was not going to discuss what was in the document in this meeting. He said he was going to give Raymond the same courtesy Raymond had not quite extended to him and do this privately. He said Raymond should speak with his lawyer and that his own lawyer would be in touch by end of business. Then he ended the call. There was a period of negotiations that lasted 3 weeks and that Damien's lawyer described as aggressive and that Raymond's lawyer described as something considerably less suitable for general publication. The outcome was that Raymond Cole resigned from Holt Systems with a settlement that was generous enough to be legally defensible and structured in a way that made certain information about the restructuring meetings available to the press if he ever decided to revisit the terms. Raymond left the company and relocated to a house in Connecticut and was not heard from in any significant professional capacity for a considerable period afterward. The 2 board members who had been in the meetings resigned at the end of the quarter, citing personal reasons. Damien was discharged from Meridian Medical Center on a Tuesday. He stood at the entrance in clothes that were slightly loose on a body that was rebuilding itself, with Solomon at his shoulder and a car waiting. And he paused before getting in and looked back at the building for a moment with an expression that nobody with him could quite read. He had not seen Nora since the night after he woke when they spoke for 40 minutes, and she told him about Kofi, and he told her about February and his father. She had come to the floor the following 2 evenings and been told by medical staff that it was a difficult time with a lot of coming and going, and perhaps it was better to come back when things settled. She had nodded and gone back to her rounds and not pushed, because Nora Adeyemi did not push, had never pushed. Understood at a molecular level what it felt like to need people to give you space, and so gave it instinctively even when part of her wanted not to. What she did not know was that on the 3rd day, her facilities manager Gerald Park had called her into his office again. This time Gerald was wearing a slightly different expression than the last time, one that looked like a man who had received information that moved the furniture of a situation around considerably. He told her, with the same practiced sympathy turned now to practiced good news delivery, that there had been a development regarding her employment situation. That the hospital had received a significant endowment directed specifically toward maintaining current staffing levels during the service's transition. That as a result, all current contracted cleaning staff would retain their positions with the new company at their current rate and with a modest salary increase effective immediately. Gerald had said modest, but the number he named was not modest relative to what Nora had been making. It was the kind of number that covered rent and daycare and the pediatrician bill and still left something, not much, but something, and something was a category that Nora had not occupied in a very long time. She had not understood where the endowment came from. She had asked and Gerald had said it came through a charitable foundation and had given the name, which was a name she did not recognize, which was the idea, because Solomon had been very specific with the lawyers about the structure. She had sat with it for 2 days, turning it over the way you turned over something that did not quite fit the shape of the world you had been living in, something too well-timed and too precisely sized to be entirely coincidental. But when you were poor to the edge, you accepted things that kept you on the right side of it and asked questions after you were stable. She had accepted it. She had gone home that night and told Kofi they were going to be okay, and Kofi had said, "Okay, Mama," and pointed at a pigeon on the windowsill, and said Bobo with great satisfaction, and Nora had laughed with the particular quality of a laugh that had relief running all the way through it. She had not connected it to Damien. Not consciously. But there was a part of her that had not been entirely surprised either, and she examined that part of herself in the quiet moments with the honesty she brought to everything and found that it did not disturb her the way she thought it might. Because it had not been charity dispensed from above with the implicit expectation of gratitude. It had been something quieter and more precise. Someone who knew exactly what she needed and made sure it was there without requiring her to ask for it or thank anyone for it or feel the particular diminishment that came with accepting help that was designed to make you feel small. It had been given the way she gave things, without announcement, without expectation, without a return address. She thought about this and did not call the number she had for Solomon and did not go looking for an explanation. She simply kept coming to work. She kept cleaning her floors. She kept sitting with Damien's empty room for a few minutes each evening because even with him gone, the habit of the chair and the quiet had become something she needed, though she would not have been able to say exactly what it was she needed from it. 3 weeks after Damien was discharged, she came to the floor at 7:15 and found Solomon standing outside the elevator. Not in a dark suit tonight, in a plain coat, which was the first time she had seen him in anything other than a dark suit, and which, combined with the fact that he was on the floor at 7:15 without any apparent reason, told her something was different. Solomon said good evening and asked if she had a moment. Nora said she had several, but that the cart was coming with her. Solomon said of course. He walked beside her down the corridor and said that Damien Holt would like to speak with her if she was willing. He said he had been asked to communicate that there was no obligation whatsoever, that the conversation could happen wherever she was comfortable and at any time she named, and that if she preferred not to, that would be understood and respected completely. He said this last part with the particular deliberateness of someone who had been given exact instructions and was following them exactly. Nora pushed her cart and was quiet for a moment. Then she asked Solomon one question. She asked whether this was about the endowment. Solomon said he was not in a position to discuss the specifics of the foundation's activities. Nora said that was a very Solomon answer to her question. Solomon said he had been told that before. She said she would meet with him. She said Saturday morning, somewhere that was not a boardroom or a penthouse or anywhere that would require her to be a different version of herself than the one that showed up every night at 7:15 with a squeaky wheel. Solomon said he would pass that along. On Saturday morning, Nora sat across from Damien Holt at a small table in a coffee shop in the South Bronx that she had chosen because it had been on her corner for 11 years, and the woman behind the counter knew her order, and the chairs were mismatched, and the walls had children's drawings taped to them, and it was, in every possible way, the opposite of a boardroom. Kofi was with Mrs. Ferreira. Nora had her hands around a coffee cup and was wearing her own clothes for the first time in all the months she had known this man, which felt significant in a way she did not fully articulate. Damien arrived on time, alone, which she had not been certain would happen and which it turned out mattered to her more than she expected. He sat down and ordered coffee from the woman behind the counter, who gave him the full assessment that she gave everyone who came in with Nora, and then nodded once, which from her was a meaningful endorsement. He looked different outside the hospital room. Still thin from the weeks of recovery, still moving with the deliberate economy of someone paying careful attention to their body. But the gray eyes were the same eyes she had looked into the night he woke, still raw at the edges, still carrying the particular look of someone who had recently been stripped back to something true and was not entirely certain what to do with the exposure. He said he had wanted to thank her. She said he did not need to thank her. That she sat with him every night because it was the right thing to do, not because she expected gratitude. He said he was aware of that. He said that was what made it the only real thing that had happened to him in longer than he could honestly measure. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had a question. He said yes. She said, was it you? The endowment. The job. He looked at her and did not say anything. She said she needed to know because it mattered to her. Not because she was angry. She had thought about whether she would be angry and found that she was not, but for reasons she wanted to be clear about rather than just feel. She said she did not want to owe anything to anyone. That she had spent her life avoiding the particular trap of owing things to people who held the debt over you even when they smiled while they did it. That if this was something she owed, she needed to know the terms. Damien said there were no terms. He said he had not done it so she would feel obligated. He said he had done it because she had a son who called birds Bobo and she was working 3 jobs and she deserved to not be the person who fell through a gap that he had the ability to close. He said he had done it the way she sat with him, for no return, because it seemed like the basic human thing to do, and he was learning to do those again. Nora held her coffee cup and looked at him. Not with the look she might have given someone who expected to be thanked. with the look she gave things she was trying to understand completely before she decided what to do with them. She said okay. He said okay. She said she believed him. She said that she was a person who was very good at knowing when someone was telling her a truth versus performing one, and she believed him. She said she was not going to pretend the money did not matter because it did. It mattered enormously, but she was also not going to pretend that the way it was given did not matter too, and that the way it was given told her something about what he understood about people. He said he had 19 days of practice listening to what people actually needed. She said she knew. She had been there. They sat in the coffee shop for 2 hours. Kofi arrived 45 minutes in because Mrs. Ferreira had a hair appointment at 10 and arrived at the coffee shop with the full portable disaster of a 3-year-old on a Saturday morning and immediately located Damien at the table with the homing instinct of a child who sensed an unexplored person and walked directly to him and pointed at the pigeon on the sidewalk outside the window and said Bobo with complete authority, requiring confirmation. Damien looked at the pigeon. He looked at Kofi. He said Bobo. Kofi climbed onto the empty chair beside him with the ease of a child who had not yet learned that some laps were not automatically available, and pointed at a second pigeon and said Bobo again, and looked at Damien waiting, and Damien said Bobo again. And this process continued for 7 pigeons and 1 sparrow and ended only when Nora gave Kofi his juice and the external world temporarily lost its appeal. Nora watched Damien with her son with the quality of attention she gave things that were important. She watched him be uncertain about where to put his hands and then stop worrying about it and simply be present, which was not a small thing. The not worrying, she knew how much that cost some people. She watched him listen to Kofi with full seriousness, the way children needed to be listened to, as though the information was significant. She watched her son lean against the arm of this man who had been the most powerful and most alone person she had ever met and point at a bus going past the window and say Bobo. And she watched Damien look at her son and then look at her, and she saw the thing that she had seen in room 412 the night he first opened his eyes, the raw honest thing behind the gray eyes, the thing that had no strategy in it and no performance. And she understood that this man had traveled a very long way from Akron, Ohio, and the February cold to arrive at this mismatched chair in this coffee shop in the South Bronx, and that the distance was not measured in miles. She had traveled a long way herself. She said his name quietly, just to say it, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment because some things were better begun without announcement. Outside, the city moved in its enormous and different way, pigeons and buses and rain clouds building over the Bronx, and 3 people sat in a coffee shop with mismatched chairs and children's drawings on the walls and made, without fully naming it yet, the first quiet deliberate choice towards something that felt, against all reasonable expectation, like the beginning of something that was going to last. In the months that followed, Damien did something that surprised everyone who knew him and surprised no one who had been paying attention. He started the Bobo Foundation, which was not its official name but was what Kofi called it from the beginning and what everyone eventually called it too, because some names arrived before the official ones and simply refused to leave. Its official name was the Meridian Family Initiative, and its purpose was to build emergency childcare infrastructure inside hospitals specifically for night shift workers, to create financial emergency response systems for single-parent families in medical debt, and to fund legal support services for people navigating domestic situations who could not afford the lawyers the system assumed they could afford. Nora ran it. Not because Damien offered her the position as a gift, which she would have declined the same way she declined the first version of the offer in the coffee shop, not a salary, just an opportunity. He offered it because she was the most qualified person he had ever encountered for the specific problem the foundation was trying to solve, and he told her that plainly and with evidence, because Damien Holt did not know how to oversell a case, only how to make it accurately, and his accurate case was that she had lived every dimension of what the foundation was built to address and understood it not from research, but from the inside, and the inside was where solutions had to come from, or they did not come at all. Nora thought about it for 4 days. She talked to Mrs. Ferreira about it, who said, "Do you want to do it?" And Nora said yes, and Mrs. Ferreira said then do it, and that was the full extent of the counsel she needed, because Mrs. Ferreira had been her compass more times than either of them counted. She called Damien and said yes. He said good. She said she was going to do it her way, which meant the people the foundation served were going to be genuinely consulted about what they needed rather than told what they needed by people who had never experienced it. He said that was the only way he wanted it done. She said she was going to need a real budget and real authority, and she was not going to be a figurehead for anyone's good press. He said he understood. She said she believed him this time without needing to ask twice. And then she said one more thing. She said she needed him to understand that saying yes to running the foundation was separate from everything else. That she was not saying yes to anything she had not specifically said yes to, and that if that was confusing she was happy to clarify, but she did not want anything assumed. Damien said he understood completely. He said he had no interest in assumptions. He said he had spent 19 days learning the difference between what he wanted and what he was willing to do about it without permission, and that the lesson had been thorough. Nora was quiet on the phone for a moment. Then she laughed, and it was the real laugh, the one that made her face look younger, and she said that was a very good answer. He said he had been practicing. Priya came back from Portland in the spring. Not for a crisis this time. Because Damien had called her on a Thursday evening and said that he was sorry for the 4 years and for the way their mother's estate had become the thing they hid behind instead of the thing they actually needed to talk about, which was that he had not known how to be her brother since they both stopped being children, and he had chosen distance over the risk of being wrong about how to be close. He said he was not certain he was good at this yet, but that he was willing to try if she was. Priya was silent on the phone for a moment that felt very long to both of them. Then she said she had been waiting for that call for 4 years, and she was going to Portland to pack a bag, and she would be in New York by Sunday, and she was going to need to meet this woman that Solomon had told her about, because Solomon had told her things and Priya had her own questions. She arrived on Sunday. She met Nora in the same coffee shop in the Bronx, which had by that point become a standing Saturday morning arrangement that Kofi had decided was a fundamental feature of the week and protested with significant force on any Saturday it did not occur. Priya walked in and looked at the mismatched chairs and the children's drawings and Kofi in the middle of identifying 3 pigeons and a delivery truck as Bobo for a man who had once run 11 meetings before noon without a detectable human emotion. And she sat down and looked at her brother and said, "You actually laugh now. I did not know you still knew how to do that." Damien said it turned out it was like riding a bicycle. Priya said it absolutely was not like riding a bicycle and looked at Nora and said she had questions, and Nora said she had answers and probably a few questions of her own, and Priya said this was already going better than she expected. And Kofi pointed at a pigeon and said Bobo, and Priya said Bobo back without hesitation, because some things required no explanation. What happened between Damien and Nora in the following months happened the way real things happened, not in a single moment or a declared turning point, but in the accumulation of ordinary time spent in genuine company. In Saturday mornings at the coffee shop and evenings at the foundation office, where they argued with the productive energy of 2 people who respected each other's intelligence enough to push back hard. In the Tuesday night Kofi had a fever and Nora called not because she needed rescuing, but because she wanted company in the long hours, and Damien sat on the other end of the phone for 3 hours reading aloud from a book he found on his shelf, because she said Kofi fell asleep to voices and she could not do voices and read at the same time. In the morning she sent him a message that said thank you, he is fine, and he sent back a message that said good, and then after a pause sent a second message that said I did not mind. In the evening Nora stood at the window of the foundation's new office in Brooklyn and looked out at the neighborhood below, and Damien came to stand beside her, and their shoulders were close without touching, and she could feel the warmth of him, and neither of them moved away. And it was the kind of moment that is not a decision yet, but is the moment before the decision, the moment when both people know what the next step is and are simply taking a breath before they take it. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. She said, "You heard everything." He said, "Everything." She said, "Including the part where I said I was going to figure it out even when I had no idea how." He said especially that part. She said, and you did not try to fix it while I was saying it. He said I was in a coma. My options were limited. She said you know what I mean. He said I know what you mean. He said he had learned, in the long quiet at the bottom of the dark water, that listening was not the thing you did before the response. Listening was sometimes the entire thing. That being heard without being fixed was what she had given him every night, and he had understood, lying there unable to respond, exactly what it felt like to receive it, and he had not been willing to offer her anything less. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she said his name, the way she had said it on the night he first opened his eyes, the way you said the name of something you were no longer afraid of losing. And he said hers back. And Kofi, who was sitting on the floor of the foundation office sorting colored blocks into categories that made sense only to himself, said Bobo, because a pigeon had landed on the window ledge outside, and both of them turned to look at it. And both of them said Bobo, and the pigeon regarded them with the supreme indifference of a creature who had been called that name for as long as it could remember and had simply decided it was correct. A year after Damien Holt opened his eyes in room 412 of Meridian Medical Center, the Meridian Family Initiative had built emergency childcare systems in 8 hospitals across New York City, provided financial emergency support to over 400 families, and funded legal representation for 112 people navigating domestic situations they could not have navigated alone. The wall of the Brooklyn office was covered with children's drawings and photographs of families who had not fallen through the gap, and at the center of the wall was a photograph that a Foundation staff member had taken without announcement one ordinary Tuesday morning. In the photograph, Kofi stood between 2 adults with his arms raised in the particular gesture of a child demanding to be lifted, and both adults had lifted him at the same moment without coordinating it, and the 3 of them were laughing. And you could see in the photograph, if you looked at it long enough, the shape of something that had no name when it began and had a very clear name now. Nora had not known when she pulled up that plastic chair on her 4th shift that she was pulling up a chair to the rest of her life. She had simply known what her mother taught her. That silence was something you gave a room, not a person. That every soul deserved a voice in the dark. That some threads were invisible until the moment you pulled them and felt the pull come back. She had pulled, and it had come back. Damien had not known, lying at the bottom of the dark water, that the voice he was holding on to was going to be there when he surfaced. He had only known that it was the one real thing in an enormous amount of nothing, and that letting go was not an option he was willing to take. He had surfaced. And she had been there. Kofi was 4 now and had recently expanded his naming system to include cars, which were Vava, and dogs, which were Didi, and one very specific bus on their street that he had decided was named Gerald, for reasons no one had been able to determine. He still called every bird Bobo without exception. He had been taught this was their word, and he carried it forward the way children carried things that were given to them with love, without question, without revision, as a permanent feature of the world. On a Saturday morning in early spring, the 3 of them walked along the river in the particular New York light that came in April when the winter finally released its claim on the city, and everything was briefly and improbably beautiful. Kofi was between them, holding a hand on each side and swinging with the full commitment of someone who had never questioned whether the hands would hold. He pointed at a bird on the railing and said Bobo, and both adults said Bobo, and the bird lifted and flew, and Kofi watched it go with the expression of someone seeing something familiar leave and knowing it would come back, because that was the nature of birds and of things that were yours. Damien looked at Nora over Kofi's head. She looked back. And there was the invisible thread, the one her mother's mother had spoken of, the one that connected people before they had the words for what they were to each other. Not pulling anymore. Simply there. Held by both of them. Sufficient. Some things did not need more than that. If this story moved you, if you found yourself breathing differently at any point in the last few minutes, please share it with one person today. Just one. Because kindness finds its way in the dark, and so does love, and so does the particular stubborn grace of people who refuse to let silence be the last word. Like this video. Leave a comment below and tell us the moment that got you. Subscribe so you are here for the next story, because we have something coming that is going to stay with you even longer than this one. And until then, remember that the thread is real. You only have to be willing to pull it. Goodbye. We will see you in the next one.